All right, ladies, here is part 2 of our snowy, frosty forest with evergreen trees. So the other day, most of us did this top part together. Should be nice and dry by now. I scraped most of my salt off, so let's see what we have. Got a little bit of bleed under it. That's okay. We can work with that and cover that with trees, so it'll be maybe a little bit different than what the original looks like, but we'll just work with what we got and it'll be fine. So the next thing that we're going to do is actually paint some trees, which I did on my second piece already, which they're still drying a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and paint those for you so you can see how it's done. The colors that we discussed were Viridian and Cobalt. You can use Hooker's Green and Cobalt. You can use any cool green and any warm blue. So Cobalt, Cerulean. The idea is really to get like a blue spruce color. So if you have a blue spruce color, which is like a darker bluish green, you can certainly use that and not mix anything. If you don't, you can use any of those colors that I just talked about. So I did actually mix that color before a little bit ago so I could paint those trees that I just showed you. So I have them in my palette, but I had mixed my Viridian and my Cobalt that was in my palette and came up with this color. So you want it to be relatively thick. I mean, it's not thick, like it's definitely watery, but it's not super duper watery because we need sort of an opaque paint in order to cover all this dark area as we paint our trees. So just make sure that it's thick enough that when you paint, it will sit on top of these darker colors in your sky. And then this is just basically our scribble trees that we've talked about so many times before. So I'm going to start with a straight-ish line going up. I got a little bit of a bleed here, which means that I must have scratched my paper a little bit when I was scraping, which is fine. So we'll just go past that a little bit and we'll use that bleed as part of the tree. And then we're going to go ahead and zigzag our tree back and forth. Always remember to leave some air spaces, right, so that it looks like a real tree. Real trees are not symmetrical typically at all, except for maybe Christmas trees, and they cut them that way. They do that on purpose. So trees in the forest typically are not growing symmetrically. Typically there's differences. There's branches missing, there's holes, what have you. So the less perfect your tree looks, the more realistic it's going to look. And this is my number, what is this? Number 2, Princeton. I also have a number 3, so I'll try that one too and see if that makes any difference. It probably won't because they're pretty much close to the same size. So anything 2 to 4 probably will work for this round. So again, these can get as wide as you want. They can stay nice and skinny if you want. And what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up painting as many, trees as we want to paint, and then we're going to have to let them dry in order to go to the next step, which is why I painted, pardon me, trees earlier on the second piece that I did so that they would be dry enough so I could show you the final phase of this on the same video so that we didn't have to make 3 videos. So again, I do not have a microphone, so I know that the audio quality is not the greatest, but I would appreciate any feedback. I did change the direction of my camera, of my phone this time around, so it was lengthwise, and my sister had told me that when she was viewing it on her YouTube, the lengthwise made it very small. I don't really understand why that is, but she does have not an iPhone, so perhaps that's part of it. I don't know if she's got an Android or what she has, so maybe that was part of it. I'm not sure. But I decided to flip the perspective around and see if that made any difference. So I had a little spot here, so I decided just to cover it with a tree. So if you have little blemishes or mistakes, you can just try to cover those up and use your trees to do that if you want to. We're also going to end up putting a little bit of shadowing on the snow at the very end, so some of that may end up getting covered up with the shadowing, so it may not be that huge of a deal. So yeah, notice how very, very opaque this is. It is still watercolor, but it's not usually, like, we don't usually paint this saturated. We usually paint much, you know, more water, less paint. But because of the top part, because we have to cover that up and make sure that it's coherent and not two different colors from the blue to the white, make sure that that green remains green. We have to just make sure we have a really good amount of pigment in that paint for this part. So, and at the bottoms, I think I mentioned this the other day, but since these trees are sitting in the snow, you kind of have to put a couple of branches sort of at the bottom a little bit to make them look grounded, because you don't see a stem because they're sitting in the snow. So just make sure you don't have just lines. You make sure that you finish it off with these little branches at the bottom. Now, one thing I did do to enhance the color of the spruce color was, once I had my green mixture on there, I actually dropped a little bit of cobalt directly into the wet paint. So I'm going to do that now also, just so that you can see how that looks. And all that did was end up darkening some of the spots and making them even bluer than they started out. I don't know if this is showing up on camera or not, but all I'm doing is taking cobalt and loading my brush up and just dropping some drops into the wet green that's there already. In fact, you know what? I'm going to try my wider brush for that, just so I can maybe try to grab a little bit more paint. There we go. It's really hard to see. It's even hard for me to see, quite honestly, but when it dries, you'll see where those spots are. You'll see that it made it a little bit darker, maybe even a little bit bluer. And most of my wet paint is right in the center of the tree, which makes sense because that would be your darkest area. That's where you have your most concentrated needles, would be in the center. So that makes perfect sense. Just make sure you don't get backwash green into your cobalt, which I did before, and I ended up having to clean my whole well out because it turned sort of a green blue because I had green in my brush. So be careful not to do that. All right. So I've added a little bit of these cobalt spots. I'm not going to do the third tree because I want to move on to the other part. So in the original, there were 3 trees. You can do as many as you want or as many as you need. So I'm going to end up putting one over here to cover that spot up. And if you have other spots that need to be sort of fixed, you can add more to those areas. So at that point, once I've gotten all of my trees done, I'm going to let that dry. And then here we have our Movie Magic, almost dry. This one's still a little bit wet. Almost dry. But I don't know if you can see it on the video or not, but there's a little bit of blue going on in there. There's just a little bit of color difference between it, which gives it a little bit more interest. Although we are going to cover most of this up with white for the snow, but it's there. We know it's there. So I am using just Craft Smart acrylic paint. It's liquid paint. We've used this before in the past, most of us anyway. So you can use any kind of craft paint, acrylic paint that you have. If you use heavy body paint, which would be paint in a tube instead of in a bottle, you're probably going to want to thin it out with a little bit of water. So this is, here, I'll just put a little bit in here. This is very fluid paint. So we don't need to really thin that out anymore. And we want to start with a dry brush, a clean dry brush. Now I'm going to do my skinny brush, number 2. And you're just going to take the white paint and just dab some on these spots, especially the tops of the branches. So if you think about the snow falling, it's going to obviously land on the tops of things more often. So if you put a little bit on the tops of your branches, that will look very realistic. again, don't become symmetrical. Leave some areas of dark in there, because the snow does not fall on every single branch and every single bristle of the tree, and especially in the inside of the tree. It falls mostly on the outside branches because the inside ones are sort of protected by the ones above them. So leave a good amount of dark in there so that it gives it the depth that it needs to make it look realistic. Put a little bit on these bottom guys here. And because this is acrylic, it's going to cover well that green. So if you have nice sort of globs of paint on your brush, it'll just sit right on top of that. So this is not unlike what we did on the bottles. If you guys, a lot of you did the wine bottles with me a long time ago now. But we did, you remember we did all the trees and then we went back and put snow on them. It's the same idea. You're just dabbing a little bit of that white here and there to make it look like the snow landed on those branches. This is still wet right here, so I'm going to be careful with that so I don't get a weird light green snow. All right. So again, these can be as snowy as you want. Less snowy if you like the tree and you want to see more of the tree. I'm getting a little bit of a pattern here, so I'm going to break that up because I don't want to have a pattern. No patterns on our trees. Random. And then I have one more last tree to do, which we'll just finish up just for the heck of it. If you don't have acrylic white, you could certainly try China white. You'd have to probably have it very thick, very, like just very little water, lots of paint, very little water. But it will by nature probably be a little bit more transparent than the acrylic will. So the acrylic probably is the better choice for this if you have it. And if you don't and you want to bring it back in 2 weeks, I will have it with me. It's always in my bag, so we can always just throw a bit on then if you don't have any with you. All right, so there's our snow on our trees. All right, so we had trees. We let them dry. We put a bit of snow on them. And then the last thing that we're going to do is I'm using a little bit of the Payne's Gray that I had used for the background and just adding a tiny bit of cobalt to it to blue it up a tiny bit so it's not quite as gray. And that's going to be our shadow color for the snow. And this is very, very, very watered down. We just want almost dirty water, pretty dirty water, but just dirty water. We don't want it to be too dark. Maybe more water than that. Because all this is going to do is just put some low lights on the snow to make it look like there's some shadows, to make it look like there's depth. So I had done this at class the other day, this one piece right around a wet tree, which was not easy. So they're all dry now, so it'll be a lot easier to do where I don't have to sneak around it so much. So it's very, very light, very, very thin. And if you use the side of your the side of your round brush, you sort of get a little bit of these broken up brush strokes, which also gives it texture. So maybe don't use your tip, maybe use the side a little bit more so that you get a little bit of that broken up look. And this is not all over the snow, this is just in certain areas, but it is definitely under your trees. You definitely want to make sure that you have some under your trees to ground them, to make them look like they are attached to the earth. And you can actually get maybe a tiny bit darker. Oops, I dragged some green with that. You could actually get a little bit darker in those areas too if you want to, just so that it's a little bit more pronounced. So maybe a little bit more of this right into the trees and a little bit less of it elsewhere. And then just keep going until you're happy with it. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So the majority of the work was the background, which then we had to wait for that to dry completely and get the salt off and all that fun stuff. And then the trees, which we've done a lot of times before. So I know we don't all love to do trees, I get that. But practice is good. Practice will help you get better trees. So. And I'm putting a little bit more paint towards the back as well to show a little bit more of a shadow, which will translate to depth. And if you have problems back here, like little bleeds or something, getting a little darker back here will help to sort of hide that a little bit so that they don't show up as much. The other alternative that you have is if you have an X-Acto. What did I do with my X-Acto? Whoop, sorry about that. If you have an X-Acto, I know I showed some of you this the other day too, but you can always scratch into the paint as well with an X-Acto. So I'm not going to do it here because it's wet. I should have done that beforehand, but I can show you on a tree. These are perfectly dry, and just by using the X-Acto and scratching with the tip, I am taking a layer of paint off and possibly a layer of paper as well. Let me see if I can get closer a little bit. Possibly a little bit of paper too, but we're done with this. We're not going to paint on top of it anymore. So it's just giving us a little bit of a highlight. So my point was, if you had some of these little divots here, you could gently scratch some of them off as well. But remember that by scratching it, you are destroying the surface of the paper, so your paint would tend to go back into it. So think about what you're going to do before you do it. If you're going to scratch it, you may not be able to paint so closely to it because you might get some paint stuck in those areas now. Maybe you're just better off leaving it alone because it's not really that obvious anyway. And that's it. So they're a little bit different, right? But very similar. The skies came out a little differently. This one had some chunkier salt on it. This one, that salt really didn't show up at all. So similar but different. And that's it. So if you have any questions, feel free to text me. And also just let me know, aside from the audio quality, let me know what you think of the video. Let me know if the landscape is better or the portrait direction is better. And that's it. Hopefully in 2 weeks we will just be together and we won't have to worry about snow days and contingency plans. All right, ladies, have a good time painting, and I will see you soon. Bye.